He sculpted her from stone until love taught her to breathe. Rain worried the old manor like a dog at a bone. It came slantwise off the sea and struck the windows in hard bursts, then softened as if catching its breath. Then came again. In the workshop, the sound turned into a steady hush under the rasp of metal on marble. He had told himself not to start her face until morning. Sleep would have been sensible, but he was past sensible. The dream had followed him into waking like a second shadow, and now his hands did what the dream had asked. The block was clean. Carrara, a white caught between moonlight and milk. He'd squared it to the floor and chalked a grid. The first cuts were the safe ones: wedge, measure, step back, check the planes. No romance in the beginning, just angles, numbers, dust. He worked by candles and one caged bulb that hummed. The air held grit you could taste, like chalk ground with salt. He brushed his forearm across his brow and left a pale streak. The room smelled of wet stone and old wood. His dark hair stuck up in places where he'd raked a hand through it without noticing. His eyes stayed on the marble. He knew what sat inside it. He'd never met her, but he had known her for years. She came in sleep with the patience of tides. A woman walking through mist, red hair catching light that wasn't there. She'd lift her chin and look past him as if listening for something behind his shoulder, then back at him with a small, private smile. No words. Only the nagging sense that if he stepped forward, if he reached, the world would change in a way that wouldn't let him return to the old one. Tonight, the dream hadn't ended when the rain woke him. He'd carried it into this room whole. His hands found the chisel's balance before his mind caught up. He cut the first line where the bridge of a nose would rise, shallow and sure. Then the cheek planes, the slope of brow. The rhythm steadied him. Tap, lift, tap, brush. He listened for the quality of the sound, sharp when the edge bit clean, muffled when it skittered and asked for patience. Candles threw his shadow across the wall, and his own outline looked taller and leaner there, like a stranger supervising. "You're only stone," he said, not convincing himself. "You're only stone until you're not." The rain softened. The house settled with a long timber creak. A draft carried a hint of the sea, iodine and cold. He shifted his stance, rolled his shoulders, and cut again. An hour vanished. Then another. He forgot the ache in his wrists. The shape came forward grain by grain, a mouth that wasn't smiling but knew how, a jaw with quiet resolve, the sweep where hair would be suggested rather than counted. He avoided the eyes. Eyes were where truth lived, and truth belonged to mornings. He stepped back to check proportions and caught himself reaching out. His fingertips hovered a fraction of an inch from the nascent cheek. Heat rose under his skin as if he'd leaned close to a person, not a block. "Soon," he said, and didn't know which of them he meant it for. He ate nothing. He drank water that tasted faintly of old copper pipes. He worked. The storm wandered off, and the workshop found a gentler quiet. Just the caged bulb, the wax tears down candlesticks, the soft scrape of broom as he cleared curls of white from her shoulders. Dawn came blue and thin beyond the high windows, the sea a flat sheet of pewter. He told himself to stop. He didn't stop. When the first gull cried outside, he set down the chisel and faced what he'd done. The face was not finished, but the map of it was true. He'd honored the planes from the dream, brow, nose, the tender corners of the mouth. He'd given her hair a flow that hinted at movement. The eyes were still only soft hollows. Light pooled there. He felt the same pull he felt in sleep. Come closer. He laughed once because he hadn't planned that. He'd planned to be rational. He found the old stool by the bench and sat. The stool complained like an arthritic knee. "I keep seeing you," he said, and his voice sounded rough. "And then I see less of everything else." Something slid in the quiet. He snapped his head toward the far shelf where he kept his mallets, measuring tapes, and the odd old keepsake that had followed him room to room. Nothing had moved. Shadows layered shadows. The caged bulb buzzed. He released a breath he hadn't meant to hold. Fatigue sank in fast once he wasn't cutting. He rested his forearms on his knees and watched the blank eyes. He told himself to sleep a few hours before touching them. He must have dozed upright. He came back to himself with a small, clean jolt, sure that someone had spoken his name. The workshop had warmed along with the light. Sun reached through salt-streaked panes and broke into dust motes that swam like slow fire. He stood, joints popping, and checked the doors, both locked. He turned back and saw it. A single grain line had changed along the mouth's upper lip. Not cut, shifted. The curve held a new softness, a half-inch of difference that didn't belong to his last pass. He would have sworn in any court that he hadn't shaped that. He knew every mark he'd made. This one had been made in the time he'd been asleep, or in the space where sleep watched him. He looked for the rational thing: settling, microfracture, temperature change. He put his hand near the stone, not on, near. The air right there held a faint warmth, the way a wall holds sun after a day. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." He washed his hands at the deep sink until the water ran white, then clear. He drank from the tap. He came back with calm he didn't feel and a soft brush to lift dust from her face, as if dust could make a difference. The day pulled him into errands he couldn't avoid, delivery men and invoices, and one stubborn leak in the hall that needed a bucket and a patient ear. He ate bread standing up and didn't taste it. Every time his mind wandered, it wandered to the workshop, to the changed curve and the warmed air. He lasted until the first honest dark. He lit new candles, shut the doors, and stepped close enough to smell the stone again. He thought of music, then didn't put any on. The silence had a weight he trusted. He worked her hair into cleaner waves, then the base of the throat, the small hollow there where a pulse would live. He could see the lines now without chalk. He'd close his eyes, touch the chisel's edge to the marble, and the right path would present itself, a track under snow. It had never been quite like this. It felt less like invention and more like rescue. "Miranda," he said, and the name surprised him because he hadn't chosen one. It had chosen itself and walked out of his mouth. He stepped back, heart up in his throat as if he'd told a stranger a secret. He waited. The workshop said nothing. "Miranda," he said again, trying the sound. A good name, solid, clean. He felt foolish and not at all foolish at once. "I'm not crazy." The caged bulb flickered twice. The hairs on his arms lifted. It was the same electric prickle that storms brought before they broke, except gentler, as if the air were learning him. He moved to the eyes. He didn't carve them open. Not yet. He hollowed them further and set their angles so they'd catch light with intelligence. A suggestion of iris here. The hint of an inner corner there. He used the smallest rifflers with a patience he'd earned the hard way on jobs that didn't matter to him half as much as this. When he paused to breathe, he could hear the fine hiss of dust settling on cloth and skin. "Tell me something," he said, because silence had become a second person. "Tell me why I know you." The answer was nothing he could quote later. No sentence, no whisper. It was a pressure at the center of the chest, like the warm weight of a hand. A sure sense that he wasn't making a thing. He was finishing one. A stranger certainty followed it. He wasn't alone in the work. He cut gently, almost a caress, and the marble yielded like a stubborn thought finally making sense. He touched the brush to clear the lashes he wouldn't carve. He preferred to let light invent them. By midnight, the room had gathered a different kind of quiet, the listening kind. Candlelight feathered the new planes of her face. The scent of wax and stone mixed with the faintest hint of something human. Skin after rain, hair warmed by a hearth. He turned to check the doors again and felt rather than heard the sound behind him. A long, slow exhale that came from no living lungs. His throat closed. He spun back so fast the stool tipped and clattered on its side. Her mouth had parted a breath's width. Not much. Enough. "Miranda," he said, and there was no bravado left, only awe. He put his palm near her cheek again. The warmth was stronger now, and not the random warmth of sun held in a wall. This had rhythm. It rose and fell. He could almost time it. "Do you hear me?" Silence. Then the caged bulb dimmed and brightened like a cautious nod. He laughed softly, then scrubbed his face as if he could push sense back in through his cheekbones. He looked ridiculous, shirt dusted white, jaw shadowed, eyes too awake for the hour. He didn't care. "I'm going to finish your hands," he said. "If you're going to reach back, you need them." He set to work with a care he'd never given any commission. Hands could ruin a figure if they were wrong. These had to be right. He measured from wrist to knuckles, knuckles to nail bed. He worked the thumb, the web, the creases a human palm learns by living. He left the left hand open, fingers relaxed, a shape made for interlacing with another. When the first hint of pale bled into the windows, he had to stop or he wouldn't. Dawn makes honest men out of obsessions. He stepped back and stood with the ache, taking in all of it, the fine dust on the floor like snow, the dark prints of his boots through it, the candles drowning in their own wax, the woman who wasn't a woman yet, who was more than she should have been. "I'll be back after I sleep," he said. "Don't move." He smiled at himself, then at her. He turned off the bulb and left the candles to gutter. In the doorway, he paused and looked back one last time. Her left hand was a fraction higher than he'd left it, lifted just enough to close the distance between her palm and where his would be if he hadn't moved. He didn't breathe for a full count of 3. Then he did, sudden, shaky, alive. "I see you," he said. The hallway outside smelled like damp plaster and salt. He locked the workshop, pocketed the key, and told himself he'd sleep. He made it to the bedroom and lay down on top of the covers. His body felt like spent wire. He closed his eyes. She came as she always did, the mist, the slow step, the eyes warm brown and steady. But the dream changed. She reached for him with the same hand he'd just carved, and he felt it land on his chest with real weight. "Miranda," he said in the dream, and heard the name echo from 2 places at once, inside the dream and from the workshop he'd left behind. He woke in the late morning to sunlight the color of pale wheat and a silence that expected something. He didn't waste time with coffee. He didn't change his dusted shirt. He walked down the hallway, ignoring the leak and the bucket in the corner, and fumbled the key at the lock because his hands weren't steady. The door swung inward on tired hinges. The candles were dead. The room smelled faintly, impossibly, like the skin of a wrist warmed by sleep. He didn't understand how he knew that scent, only that it was hers. On the floor, the stool lay where it had fallen. On the work table, the brushes had rolled a few inches and stopped. On the stone, the changes were small but undeniable. The parted mouth had found a new confidence. The eyes, still uncut, held light where no light directly struck, and the left hand, the open one, waited at a height that matched his own. "You're not only stone," he said. He moved closer, slow, as if approaching a skittish animal. He lifted his hand and held it above hers. The air there had the faint heat of a breath shared under a blanket in winter. He didn't touch. Not yet. He wasn't afraid of breaking the spell. He was afraid of doing it wrong. "Tell me how," he said. "Tell me what you need." The room listened. Somewhere outside, the sea hit rock and fell back with a thud you could feel more than hear. A gull laughed like a heckler. He waited. A thought arrived as clean and complete as a blueprint. Finish the eyes at dusk. Not noon, not now. Dusk, when day and night traded keys. He didn't know how he knew that, but the sense of it was bone deep. "Dusk," he said, and the word fit. He set the shop to order, not to pass time, but to prepare. He cleared the floor, changed the wax, put fresh water in the tin at the sink. He laid out the smallest tools, the ones that could shape a world without anyone hearing much noise about it. As the day moved, he moved with it, restless but not frantic. He ate without tasting again. He braced the ladder and fixed the loose slate on the roof because he could no longer stand the idea of rain coming in where she was. Dusk found him back at the block with a candle in each corner and the caged bulb off. The sea went the color of iron. The first star showed, maybe a planet, steady and white. He lifted the chisel. "All right," he said. "Miranda, look at me." He cut. The first new whisper of stone on steel was so soft it could have been a breath. He worked the inner corners, the lid line, the shallow bowl where an iris would borrow light. He didn't carve pupils. He never did. He angled planes so reflections would do that work. Little by little, he brought her gaze forward. The room had narrowed to a circle of wax glow, and the sound of his own pulse in his ears. When he set the tool down, the sky outside had gone full ink. The candles danced in tiny drafts he couldn't feel. He backed away 2 paces, 3, and let his eyes adjust to hers. She was looking at him, not the blank look of a finished piece, not the clever trick of angles. This had awareness in it, focus, recognition like a hand tightening after sleep. "Hi," he said, because anything bigger would break his voice. He lifted his hand, palm out. Her open hand, carved, impossible, shifted the smallest measure toward his. Warmth gathered in the space between. "Tomorrow," he said, throat tight. "Tomorrow, we do the rest." He felt the lie. He wasn't going to sleep much, but he could stand inside this moment without rushing it. He could stand here and learn the size of what had begun. Somewhere in the house, a board sighed. The candle's flames tipped, as if leaned toward by someone who wanted to see better. The air thickened the way air does before lightning. He smiled, the kind that found its way up from the chest rather than down from the face. "I see you," he said again. And for the first time, in the exact center of the room, he felt seen back. He woke late and sure he'd missed something important. The workshop key lay on his chest where he didn't remember putting it. Sun glazed the hallway. The bucket beneath the leak had overflowed a little, leaving a crescent on the floor like a dropped moon. He stepped around it and went straight to the door. The air in the room had changed overnight. Dust still hung in the beam from the high window, but it moved with a lazy drift, not the nervous jitter of yesterday. The candles he'd left burned out had fallen in on themselves and hardened into ripples like putty pressed by a thumb. He set the key on the bench and listened. The sea worked the cliffs with its old patience. Farther off, a truck labored up the road to the village. The caged bulb was dark. The workroom smelled faintly of salt and wax and something like warm skin after sleep. He hadn't imagined that. It was a real scent, the kind that drew memory out of hiding even when it couldn't say what memory. Morning light softened the planes of her face. He saw the work he'd done, good choices, honest lines, and the work he hadn't done, which was where the life waited. The new eyes didn't glare, they regarded. That was the difference. "Good morning." His voice came out lower than he expected. He cleared his throat. The sound startled a gull from the roof. He almost apologized to a bird. "I brought you something." He held up a square of linen and a small bowl of water. The water was clean, cold enough to bite his fingers. He dipped the cloth and wrung it out until it didn't drip, then gently wiped the marble dust from her cheek and jaw, the way you'd wipe sleep from a child's face without waking her all the way. The cloth picked up the faintest gray, like ash. He rinsed and did it again. He hadn't carved the ears yet. He liked to save them for last. Ears registered care more than most people thought, and the unfinished edges made her look vulnerable. He set down the cloth and touched the base with the backs of his fingers. Habit, checking for instability, fractures, anything that would telegraph trouble. The stone felt steady, solid, warm. "Tell me if I'm doing this right," he said. A draft moved across his forearms, not cold, a steady pressure like breath crossing skin. He stood still to learn it. The room seemed to hold him there, with a hand between his shoulder blades. He didn't push back. He spent the morning on everything except the obvious: platform and plinth, the suggestion of the weight-bearing foot under the fall of her gown, the edge of fabric where it broke over an ankle. When he cut fabric from stone, he thought about gravity and the mercy of it, how it made a thing believable. He ate late, bread, an orange, a strip of hard cheese, and balanced the paper plate on the stool while he stepped back and squinted to see the hole. He preferred to feel full right there, with her, crumbs and all. He wiped his hands on his pants without thinking and laughed at himself. He set the chisel down when he caught himself pushing for the next big moment just to feel the jolt. That way lay mistakes. He walked the room instead, putting stray tools back, coiling cords, sweeping the white drift into neat hills that looked like the edge of a quiet storm. When the broom whispered past the base, something tapped twice. Not loud, not imagined. He froze, listened. Tap, tap. He crouched and put his ear near the stone. Silence. He set his palm along the veining that ran like fine smoke through her lower skirts. It felt the same as before. Steadiness with a pulse under it he could not explain. He climbed his eyes back up her until he reached the hands. The left hand, his open, waiting hand, had shifted a fraction. The angle of the wrist was new. Not in the sweep marks, not in his chalk lines, in the living geometry of how fingers rested when they'd been used, however briefly. "Okay," he said, low. "You're in there." He didn't touch her. He stood and took 3 slow breaths, the way he used to before stepping under a heavy block swinging on a chain. Calm, attention, no drama. The rest of the day followed a rhythm he didn't invent. He'd feel a pull to one feature, work it until the pull eased, then leave it alone. The right hand needed its tendons suggested under the skin. He shaped them until the line read as strength rather than tension. He moved to the throat and softened the notch at the collarbone. He made room for breath. He didn't say her name often. When he did, the air seemed to concentrate. Not magic. Concentration. A listening. It made the top of his spine buzz. He tried music once, low, a cello piece that made the room feel longer. Halfway through the first track, the caged bulb flickered and the speaker hissed and died. He didn't try again. He hummed, barely, when the work asked for steadier hands, a tune his mother had used while darning socks. The sound settled his breathing. The air kept time. By evening, clouds had rolled up from the horizon like a slow army. Their bellies held the town's last light and pressed it into the sea. He lit 4 candles, one on each corner of the bench, and left the bulb off. The world beyond the glass took on the black blue of tools oiled for storage. The workshop tightened around the 2 of them, every draft a note. "Dusk," he said, and the word felt like a key put into a lock. He moved to the ears. The old superstition said, carving ears invited a figure to hear you. He didn't believe in superstitions until he did. He shaped the curve clean, the inner shell where sound gathers like rain. He gave her a slight asymmetry on purpose. Perfection bored him. People were built of nearlies. When he leaned in to clear dust, his breath warmed the stone and came back at him warmer. He stopped and held very still. A sound rose at the edge of hearing, a soft hiss, not from the bulb, not from the street. He felt it more than heard it, a thread pulled across his chest. He spoke just above a whisper. "What do you need?" The sound answered by shifting. Not words. His back prickled. He set the brush down and tried again. "Show me." He took up the smallest chisel and touched it to the corner of her mouth, not to change the shape, just to let the steel rest there like a question. The pressure in the room flattened, then deepened. He eased the tool away. He understood, in a way that bypassed language, that she wanted this pace. Not a lunge at the finish. the careful approach that makes a bridge hold. The first raindrop ticked the window. He worked until his hands said stop. He washed up and returned to stand exactly where he was when the day turned over. The wind changed. The house leaned. The storm arrived without fanfare and got to it. A curtain of water dragging knuckles across the glass, the mutter of thunder feeling its way. He pulled a thin blanket from the peg and tossed it across the stool, a habit from winters when the stone bled heat from the room. He didn't sit. He stayed close enough to feel the heat that shouldn't be there, but resisted the urge to test it with his palm. You didn't test a thing like this. You stayed present for it. Lightning opened the room for a heartbeat and shut it again. The candles did their bow and sway and recovered. He let his eyes acclimate back to the small. The small was where truth lived. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again, twice, then gave up. The storm blotted out the rest of the world anyway. He felt oddly safe inside it, the way a child does under a thick quilt while the house talks to itself. He closed his eyes and listened without asking for answers. He caught a shape, not a word, not quite a tone. The shape had the curve of his name in it, missing consonants the way a mouth does when it's learning. He opened his eyes. Say it again. The candles whispered. The wind lifted and dropped. He waited. L. It came across the room like a sound made behind glass. Thin, threaded with air. He didn't move. He couldn't. His lungs forgot their job and then remembered in a rush that made him dizzy. Again. Elias. He bent at the waist and let his hands hang until the blood came back to them. He stood up into a room that had stepped closer around him. He looked at her mouth. It hadn't opened further. The change was in the space between them. The voice had lived there for an instant and gone. I hear you. The first laugh that broke from him wasn't pretty. It sounded like something forced out after being held too long. He didn't care. He wiped his eyes on the back of his wrist, embarrassed for nobody's benefit, and got to work on the small things again. Because the small things had become holy. He shaped the pads of her fingers, not much, just enough to imagine the weight of a cup, the edge of a doorframe, a palm against his jaw. He scored the faint lines at the base of each finger, the ones a life writes by doing ordinary tasks. He thought of her learning to button, to braid, to turn a page. He wanted the hands to make those things believable. When he paused to breathe, the scent in the room had shifted toward human. Linen warmed by a body, orange peel, candle smoke curling under clean hair. He catalogued it the way he always did, running inventory against surprise. It didn't go away. His phone buzzed one last time. He pulled it out and turned it off without checking who wanted what. He slid it under a rag as if it were a loud toy in church. Do you remember me? He asked it softly, not for effect. He genuinely wanted to know if the dream had been only his. A pause. Then, you. Clearer than before, though still faint. It landed in the center of him the way a thrown pebble lands in a still pool, widening out in rings. He followed those rings until they touched something like relief and something like fear, and, inside both, joy so sudden it made his mouth ache. What do you need from me? Stay. The word was almost whole. It made his knees weak, in a way he knew he'd make fun of himself for later, if later ever felt ordinary again. I'm not going anywhere. He worked until his shoulders burned. He drank water and ate another piece of bread he didn't taste. He checked the roof because the storm shifted and hammered one corner hard. He came back dripping and left wet footprints that dried faster than they should have. The room was warm now, storm or not. A deep rumble rolled the windows in their frames. He felt it in his ribs. The lights in the village blinked out and back as the grid thought about giving up. The caged bulb winked once, then made its decision, and stayed dark. The candles held. He looked at the ceiling as if expecting it to answer for the weather. Not yet, he told the storm. He wasn't sure who he was bargaining with. He returned to the face. Not to change it, to stand before it and let it register him. He lifted his hand to the height of hers. He left an inch of space between them. The air there felt like the surface of warm water, skin thin, quivering. Miranda. The name fit the room now, not just his mouth. It felt like calling across a small, clear lake. The answer came back without echo. Warmth gathered on his palm. Not heat, warmth. A steadying kind that had temperature and weight. His hand trembled. He let it. He lowered it the smallest distance until the space between was a breath. Something changed around the edges of the world. Sound went sharp. The hairs on his forearms rose as if a storm had bent down to smell him. He watched her lips. The upper lip lifted the fraction of a fraction. The lower lip softened. A thread of air crossed the inch between and touched his skin like a secret. He exhaled like he'd been underwater. Hi. The corner of her mouth tried to answer. Not a smile. A rehearsal for one. The eyes, stone, angled to borrow light, seemed to wet for a second. He knew that wasn't possible. He believed it anyway. He lowered his other hand to where her open palm waited. He didn't press. He matched shape to shape, the curve of his knuckles to the arc of her fingers. The warmth there deepened, then pulsed, once, twice, like a bird testing new wings. Her fingers moved, not far, enough to change everything, the smallest flex, the lightest curl, and he felt the ghost of contact that wasn't ghost at all. He closed his eyes because sometimes seeing is too much. He opened them because not seeing was worse. Stay, she said again, the words steadier, as if she were learning her own mouth. I'm here. Thunder laid its flat hand over the house. The candles bowed and righted themselves. A drop found its way through somewhere and hit the floor with the sound of a tick on a pocket watch. He didn't look away from her. He spoke without moving his lips much, like a man in church trying not to disturb anyone else's prayer. Tomorrow, he said, we try for more. Her fingers answered with a second, braver curl. The warmth in his palm spread up his wrist in a quiet tide. He backed away one slow step, then another, because if he stayed right there, he'd press too hard and rush what didn't want rushing. He took in the room to ground himself, the dark windows, the neat drifts of dust, the thin blanket on the stool, the chisels lined like cutlery for a meal he wouldn't eat. The storm kept working. The world went on. Inside that, a breath crossed the space between a man and a piece of stone. Good night, he said. The candles burned without smoke. The air held steady. The smallest sound came from the sculpture, almost nothing, just the whisper of material changing its mind. He stood in the doorway a long time before he had the nerve to turn off 2 of the candles and leave the other 2 burning. He locked the door and felt a light pressure along the back of his hand as he did, like a promise signed by touch. He went to bed with his clothes still on and lay there listening to the storm. He wondered if he should be afraid. He wasn't. He felt the kind of fear that means you're exactly where you belong, and the cost will be worth it. He closed his eyes and saw brown eyes open in the half-light, not carved now, but living, and red hair catching a flicker of flame that didn't smoke. He slept like a man on watch, ready to wake to a voice that would be stronger the next time it called his name. He sleeps beside the miracle he carved, unaware that dawn will change everything. Part 2, When Stone Learns Breath, coming soon. If you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching.